Hello, widowhood. Our conversation today is with Mr. Fred Colby. He is the author of Widower to Widower, the conversation regarding his wife, Teresa, his journey, learning how to live again, and just being able to provide a voice for the widowers who are often are underrepresented in this conversation of grief. This conversation will be helpful. And I would recommend picking up his book, whether it's for yourself trying to understand a widower or if you are a widower and looking for guidance in how to manage your grief journey. Let's get into this conversation now.
Many people talk about the ups and downs of married life, but no one really prepares you for life after your spouse passes away. Welcome to Widowhood Real Talk with Tina, a safe place for widows, widowers, and their friends and family to talk about love and loss. Find comfort as you listen to honest conversations between Tina and invited guests who've experienced the loss of their forever partner. Share their stories of love, grief, and healing. You are not alone in this journey. Join today's episode and discover a wealth of resources and learn how to connect with others who are traveling the same path. This is Widowhood Real Talk with Tina.
Fred Colby, welcome to Widowhood Real Talk with Tina.
Hi, Tina. How are you doing?
I am doing good. I am so looking forward to this conversation. When I found your information on YouTube, when I was talking about different things as far as when you're prepared to date, and what drew me to you were the things that you spoke about to allow someone to consider these items and the idea about envisioning walking on the beach with someone and seeing a future with them was just very telling to me from your perspective. So to be able to have your book, Widower to Widower, and to have this discussion with you, I know will be very helpful to our community.
I'm looking forward to it. And I always enjoy reaching new audiences. So I take every opportunity I can get because I'm on a man on a mission, to reach the other widowers out there and help them get through this.
That's very good because you and I both know that. And when you look at the word widowhood, the men are the smaller percentage that are
Right.
accounted for. They don't always have the voice in the conversation. So to be able to have a conversation with someone that has written literature, has been a widower, and be able to bring that voice is very important. So thank you again.
Great. Thank you.
So where are you at right now?
I'm in Fort Collins, Colorado. Lived here since 2008. My wife and I moved here to be near our two daughters who decided to move here and start having grandbabies. And that kind of decided it for us.
That is a deciding factor. Where were you before then?
San Diego for just about all my life.
Oh, okay. Born and raised there, or what had you in the
I was
area?
born in Seattle right after World War II. And my dad died when I was about 5 or 6. My mom moved in with my grandfather, who had a place in San Diego.
Okay.
We lived with them for a year or two, and then he remarried after he had lost his wife. And then my mom moved into another place, and then she met my second dad and remarried a couple of years later. I was very fortunate to have a second gentleman come into my life to be a father as well.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. How do you look back on that differently now, being an adult and seeing the things that people in your family experience in their losing a life partner?
Oh, very differently. I think back to my grandfather, who my grandmother had gone through a phase of dementia of some type. Back in those days, they didn't really define it very clearly. He and my second father, my stepfather, met at a church, and they had been part of rebuilding the church. And so my grandfather, after he met his new bride, introduced my second father to my mom. And,
Wow.
back in the day, people didn't always look kindly on that, but I think we have a different view these days, but it's still something you have to really be careful about how you approach it. It brings up a very sore subject for many people and families and can become the cause of divisions and all kinds of things. So I was very lucky that this blending worked well because my mom had 4 kids. Why he wanted to take on 4 kids, God only knows, but he did. And then they had 2 more. So, but he died
Wow.
when I was around 21, 22.
Mm,
So looking back on what my mom went through, losing her first husband after World War II shortly. And then her second husband, when I was around 20, 21, I look back on that and I say, how did she get through that? It's rough enough getting
Yes.
through one, but a second one on top of that. So when I lost my wife, Teresa, it's funny. My mom and I didn't really emotionally connect in a lot of ways, and we did not over that either. But I could tell that she understood what I was going through and was supportive. She had a German upbringing, so they weren't real emotive, if you will.
Mm.
Same with her dad. So all my brothers and sisters talk about that, why wasn't she more expressive? And so I and some of my siblings have had an reaction to that by being much more emotive than our mom was.
Now, my last name is Cornwall, which is German. My late husband, Mark,
Ah,
German means before the force. I want
right.
to circle back to something you said about
Okay.
the mindset. When you were speaking about the mindset, as far as were you referring to your mother remarrying or for your grandfather or both?
Really both. The mindset in the community back in those days was, it may have started changing around then because World War II definitely affected a lot of things. But for example, my mom's sister also lost her husband and she never did remarry. And she was a beautiful, smart woman. She just never remarried. So attitudes were beginning to change because of World War II, but it was a difficult thing to do.
I find, thank you for sharing that. I find that even today, when I am speaking predominantly with women, there is
Right.
still more of a mindset that I will never remarry, that was the love
Mm-hmm.
of my life, and not allowing themselves permission to
Right.
be able to see that life could hold another love of your life, that you could have another relationship that can be
Right.
um, extremely fulfilling. I will not lean towards comparing one to the other because no one's going to win that. But
Right.
fulfilling for you in this season of your life, which is different than when you probably met your spouse.
Yeah. And it's so men do experience this differently. And it's
Yes.
in part is because I like to touch on when, if my wife had died first, I mean, if I had died first and my wife was the survivor, she would have had literally 20 close friends embracing her, loving her, holding her, offering their support in so many ways. Whereas I and so many other widowers find themselves alone. If they're lucky, they got one or two close friends. And if they're lucky, one of their two close friends is willing to give them a hug. They don't really know how to react and deal with it. It's very, very common to hear a widower say, God, I was such an asshole.
Oh,
Because before I lost my wife, how I treated other people who had lost theirs was so lacking in empathy and
yes.
understanding. And now they're like, oh, I didn't know it was like this, So it's a new awakening for men to go through this. But widows and women tend to have a more not just social, but emotive side and so on that lends themselves to that support. Whereas men find themselves not just alone, I mean, totally alone. And let's face it, they've become reliant on their wives to provide their social interaction,
Yes.
support, love, caring, advice, you name it. It just goes on and on and on. And when that is gone, it's literally not only ripped half a person away from you, you just don't know what to do with what's left.
That is
So
so true.
it's very painful. And men, as a result, tend to be much more willing to enter the dating scene earlier because they're so desperate for that companionship, for somebody to talk to, somebody to touch them, somebody to hold them and wish them support, that type of thing. Whereas women, I have found, and I'll never, like you said, I'll never say everybody's like this because they're not.
Right.
Everybody's experience is unique. But I've run into an awful lot of widows that wait not 1 but 2 years before they start dating
Yes.
because they don't feel the same urgency as the man does. And they've got the support system, they've got the love. So when they look for a male companion, they're looking truly for a companion to go and do things with, go to the shows with, maybe take a hike with, all those kinds of things. And they're just not so desperate for somebody to be in their life 24/7 as the men often are.
That is very common. Thank you. Now, tell us how you met Teresa.
Oh, I love to tell that story.
Good.
I was 2021 going to community college, and a friend of mine and I would alternate hosting rather large parties at each other's
Okay.
houses.
Quote, quote.
and and one time we were having it at his house, and he goes, Fred, I met a gal that reminded me of the one that you told me about that you had met at the college. And I said, oh, sounds great. And he says, I invited her to come. And she and some other gal friends stopped off at our party on their way to Los Angeles to a really big party. And I saw her, and she was not the one I was talking about, but I saw her and I just instantly was drawn to her. We sat and talked for a half hour. I took her out back, talked to her for another 20 minutes, got her phone number, and then they flew out of there. But I called her the next day when she was back home, and we never dated anybody else after that. Got married within a couple of years, and had a wonderful 45 years together.
Wow. So there's so much that happened in that 45 years.
Yes.
How did you propose?
It was pretty funny because initially I proposed to her when we were just out on a date, and I said, what do you think? So let's get married. It wasn't a real down on the knee type of thing, but
Okay.
she said, sure, yes. Went back and told her parents, and they ignored us. They were like, nope, not happening, not now.
Oh,
We'd been together, maybe 6 months to a year.
that's kind of quick.
And
Okay.
they just weren't ready to accept that was going to happen. Plus, I found out later they didn't have any money in the bank to pay for a wedding.
And then at that time, it was expected that the bride's family would pay for the
Right.
wedding. Okay.
Right. So we moved in together and lived together for about another 6 months to a year. And I think the parents got the message that we were serious, one way or
Indeed.
the other. So we came back and said it again. And this time they said, okay, let's figure it out. And we're very supportive from that point forward.
Wow. Tell me some of your favorite memories about Teresa.
Oh boy, there's so many. What I always loved about her was that everyone was just drawn to her. She was one of those wonderful women who just is so loving and accepting. I don't care what the person's culture was, background was, doesn't matter. They would all just be drawn to her, and she would just welcome them in and become their best friend. So it was fun to watch her. It didn't matter whether it was a work environment, volunteering at the schools, whatever it was. And she just had a way of laughing and enjoying life every day that made the world brighter for everybody around her. And she just accepted everybody in. And I was very fortunate because she taught me a lot about being more empathetic and loving and things of that nature.
Okay. You actually answered my next question about what did you learn from her, and you just mentioned that. Thank you.
Right, right.
I want to give you space to answer this question without
Okay,
me asking a lot of questions as
okay,
you go along this. I would like for you to share what led to Teresa's transition from this world, from wherever you want to pick that up to however you want to
okay.
say that part of your journey.
Yeah, we were pretty fortunate in not having a lot of serious health issues. I had one about 3-4 years prior to her, so around 2010. I had some really bad skin cancer, not melanoma, but basal cell type skin cancer and stuff. So I went through a year of radiation and treatment and so on. But we had 2 years together with, we could just do whatever we wanted to do. We're able to go and travel and things of that nature. And then all of a sudden, and about halfway through 2014, she started getting these rashes, and we didn't know what it was. We went to the doctor couldn't explain it, went to another doctor, couldn't explain it. The rash got worse. It was driving her nuts. Finally, my older daughter saw her and said, "We're going to the emergency room. We're going to go figure this out." So took her in, and they started running a lot of tests like they should have before, but they didn't. And found out that she had uterine cancer.
Mm.
So we found a really good doctor to work with on that. She had to go through the whole series of surgeries, chemotherapy, and then radiation. She had just started, and that was over what, a 4 or 5 month period, something like that, 6 month period starting with the surgery. And, the people around her were getting better. And I noticed that she wasn't, and she
Mm.
seemed just really tired all the time. So I asked the doctor, we said, let's get a transfusion. Maybe that'll help her. Took her in, walked her in to get the transfusion, had to take her out in a wheelchair because she was so wiped out from the treatment. Got her home. She had a mild stroke that night. They came, took her away, went to the hospital. They said, "We're sorry. It's back full force. There is nothing we can do now." So
Mm.
that started the dreaded death knell, if you will, waiting, seeing how this is going to happen, something I hadn't experienced firsthand before. I'd lost people before, but I had not been there with them. Oh, and it
Mm.
happened. So my daughters had found Pathways Hospice, and they helped us set up the hospice set up in the house, like within a couple hours. I brought her home, uh, put her in there, and she only had a week left to live. We didn't know that at the time. We thought it was going to be 2, 3, or 4. And I had started setting up a caring bridge, which your listeners may or may not be familiar with. It's an online website where you can exchange messages and let people know what's going on in somebody's process of either healing or passing, so that you don't have to call 50 people. You don't have to email 50 people. You put it up one place and they can check it at their leisure, send their support messages back, which in our case, I or my daughters would read to her. They sent her cards and all that type of stuff. And it was, you're kind of numb to it when you go through it because you're so focused on just doing the job at hand, making sure she is okay. And we got to about a week into it. And one night I felt like she's really close to the end. But I've been up all day. I told her, I got to go lie down for a couple hours. So I did. And I set the alarm. Before the alarm went off, I woke up and I could hear her very labored breathing. It was a different kind of breathing than I usually would hear. I knew something was going on. I knew it probably was near the end. So I ran downstairs and I just sat next to her. I was so glad I had this opportunity to do this. I just sat there and held her hand, stroked her arm, and let her know, it's okay, honey. If you got to go, this is the time. Go ahead. We'll be okay. I'll make sure the girls are okay. I'll be okay. And she suddenly hit this little period of this breathing where she's going like, ah. She's just trying to take the air in, but she had nothing to give. There was no breath out. It was
Mm.
just like, she couldn't take anything really in. She couldn't give anything back to the world. It was her time to go. And so that's when she passed. And my daughters were able to come over and be with her a little bit after she passed before they came and picked up the body.
And thank you for sharing that. And I know that may be something you share a lot. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes
Right.
it can bring you right back to that place and take something out of you.
Yes.
So I don't take these conversations lightly. And I know you're doing this to be able to help other people, but
Right.
I do want to acknowledge that that is not always an easy conversation to
Right.
have. How
No.
old were your daughters at that point?
Let me see. So they would have been about 30, 35.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you said, and you told your wife you would be okay. Were you okay?
I was numb for a week. So, can't really decide if you're okay or not. You just kind of going through the steps that are required, going to the funeral parlor, making the arrangements for the body, and notifying the right people that you have to notify. And then in our case, my daughters helped me set up a celebration of life at a little restaurant where we could invite all of her friends. And I, just like I said, sleepwalked through that all. I went around, had a smile on my face, said hi to everybody because that's who I am normally. And then the day after it, I went to the mountains. I escaped to the mountains because I knew I needed time alone and I didn't want to be around anybody when I was going through what I was going through. And I was very fortunate to have a place to go to. And I would go outside and I would just yell at the top of my lungs. I
Mm.
just let it all out. And that did help some. And it took several days for me to get from the very peak of the grieving down to something I would say was moderated enough that I had control of myself. You know what I mean? It
Yes.
felt like I could go back home. So I did, and went and visited my daughters and let them know, you know, I'm going to be going through hell for the next few months. So we need to have a code word
Okay.
to say, to each other. And it was just, I feel like crap, something like that. And then they would know to leave me alone. And then they could do the same with me. And I'd know, okay, they're going through their process. Just leave them alone. Because one thing you learn through this that I think is very, very important, I try and get this message across all the time. You cannot escape the grief. You must confront it. You must process it. It is painful. There's no way to make it not be painful. So it's just better to accept that you're going to have to do it and face it. Now, you ask, how can you face grief? Well, for me, it meant that when those waves of grief would hit me, I wouldn't try and all of a sudden get busy. I'd
Mm.
sit down right there and I'd let it hit me. I would cry, I would scream, I'd do whatever I had to do to work my way through that, anywhere from 5 minutes to half an hour, whatever it was. And that helped me get through some of the worst of it. The other element is, for example, bringing out your old photo albums of the family. You want to guarantee you're going to make yourself cry? That'll do it. Right? You just think all
Yes.
these wonderful moments you had, and now she's gone. You don't have her with you anymore. But it's actually good for you to do that. And by facing it head on, you're recognizing, and I say it's a way of remembering, honoring, and loving your wife, or in case of a widow, your husband's life. And that's important. It's important that we don't try to forget. And when we just try and do busy projects and ignore it, we're just putting it off. That's all we're doing. And I know of people, because I've talked to them, who a year, 2 years later, they've been busy, redoing their basement, all kinds of different things. And then all of a sudden they have a day where they don't have that going on and they just get clobbered. And
Yes.
it is so painful. And they say, why am I back to month one? That's because you didn't process it during month 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and that's kind of like the minimum period of time it takes to just process the worst of it. Many people, it'll last 2 years, 3 years. And I've talked to these people and I try and figure out what is it that's different about their experience from mine. Why are they still deep grieving after 2 or 3 years? And I think sometimes it's because they tried to avoid it, sometimes because they isolated themselves in their house, didn't interact with other people. And sometimes I hate to say it's because of alcohol and drugs. You don't process grief when you're in alcohol and drugs. I found out very quickly that if I had a third glass of wine, I would get so wallowing into my grief, and just, oh, woe is me, and so on. Well, that didn't help a thing. I learned very quickly. So I learned to limit myself to 1 or 2 drinks of wine, whatever I was having it at most, and to never have that third, unless I was out with a group and having a good time and not going to get into that mode again, you know.
Those are very good points, and I want to go back to some. And what I think you identified were patterns that you could see in people that seem to be in a place of being stuck.
Right.
And you mentioned isolation, alcohol, drugs, and what was the other item you just mentioned?
Let me see what else. Yeah, drinking and drugs.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Isolation, and was it just not
isolation.
price isolation? The other 2 things I will add into that, that I
Okay.
see very often is people coping with, sex, not so much as a relationship, but just running from one sexual relationship to
Oh
another.
God, yeah, yeah, yeah.
The item that is also difficult, and this is not so much as someone not processing, it's just the nature of the situation, someone with young children.
Mm,
That changes the
yes,
dynamics of
it
your
does.
grief different. Those people have processed it. Those people are having grief therapy for their children, grief for
Right.
themselves. But when you are raising young children and you are grieving that partner, the dynamic of working through being stuck in depression is a different dynamic that
Yes.
no one else would be able to understand. So I wouldn't put them in that category
Right.
based on the nature of conversations I've had with people and just what that looks like when you are raising young children. I know a woman that, as she shares very openly to educate other people, that just the other day, her youngest daughter saw her dad's shirt and go, "How is dad's shirt here and he's not here?"
Oh, yeah.
And the parenting of that, where you had this plan to be this couple, and now you are operating as a single parent. The world
Yes.
doesn't know how you're showing up. And so the layers of all of that, you and I happen to have adult children when
Right.
our our partners pass, but people with young children, that dynamic could take 2, 3, 10 years until those children are adults because oftentimes they are not allowed to able deal with their grief because they're so
Right.
busy parenting and doing those things. So I would escape them from that group that you may find it maybe
Right.
not be able
And
to move
I
out.
agree that what I say applies mostly to people 55 and up. And
Okay.
you know, when I talk to gentlemen who are younger in their 40s and have a couple kids and so on, I recognize it's a very different experience. And I got to give them all the credit in the world. Some of these guys are amazing what they do, you know, for 5, 10, 15 years. And, you know, painfully, they often have to leave the dating world. It's just too much to try and build a relationship where you got 2 or 3 kids to take of that demand your full attention. So it's hard. It's, you know, it's hard enough when you're a divorcee, but even more so when you're a widower, because you just got a whole different elements you're dealing with.
Absolutely. What prompted the writing of this book?
Ah, well, few months after I lost Teresa, I recognized I needed help, and I went to Pathways Hospice, and they had a nice little grief therapy program. It started with where you were in a small group of 4 to 6 people, which common as is common, 5 women and me. That was for an introductory grief session. And then they had a group session, which was up to 16 people, even 20, I think. And again, it was about 8 women for every guy. And then finally, they had an individual grief counseling, which I took advantage of. And I had a wonderful counselor. In fact, her name's on the book. She helped me a lot. But I kept asking her these really difficult questions about what I was going through and what do I do about it? What's been other people's experiences? Neither one of us could find any answers because there are so few books out there directed to men. They're
Yes.
directed to widows in general, which means women. And if you're lucky, a 200-page book, you'll find 3 to 5 pages about men. That's about it. So my therapist finally, after doing all this, said, Fred, why don't you just write the book? You know how to write, right? So, and I've written thousands and thousands of pages of articles, grant applications, and PR materials, newsletters, things of that nature. So I said, maybe I could do it. And
Yeah.
I, yeah, maybe. So I had started about a month before Teresa passed the Caring Bridge account. which was basically blogs
Yes.
available through a website format. And so I went back and looked at those and I said, oh, I could use these because I had written them from there up till a year after she passed. I had still been doing them. And I recognized that those blogs allowed me to go right back into the moment of when I wrote them. So I felt the same feelings, had the same awakenings, the same realizations, things of that nature. And I said, I can use that as the basis. And then right from that, what I learned, well, interject, in the interim, I'd started a men's grief group at the Pathways Hospice. So I wasn't relying just on my experience. I was relying on the experiences of all the men widowers who came through that grief group as well, which really helped a lot. Plus, I was just doing research left and right. Any article I could find, any information I could find, I'd save it, write it down. And then, so I was able to take the blogs which say talk about what happens when you find out your wife is going to die. You could spin off of that with examples, with data, with stories from other widowers. So it wasn't just my experience, because I recognized mine was not the only experience, that people had to see what somebody else experienced so they understood it's okay for them to do it differently.
Yes.
Right. So that's kind of how I got started on it. And before I knew it, I had a 200-page book, and I put that out there. I tried to get it published. I was too impatient. So I wanted to get it out there and start helping guys. So I went and self-published and sold, a fair number of books. But then I recognized about a year into it, I said, I'm still missing a lot of stuff. So I went back, I re-edited all that was already there. I added a whole bunch of new information I discovered, all kinds of new examples I'd gotten from various guys in my grief groups, and then added new sections of new things I had learned since then that just made the book so much stronger and made it more comprehensive. So that one I put out, what has it been, 2 years now? Yeah, 2 years now, I think. So it's been doing very well. I've sold about 6,000 copies, which is pretty good for a self-published book.
Okay. Thank you. You mentioned that you started a grief group and that was predominantly for men. Is that something you still do now?
I stopped doing it about a year ago. I did the one at Pathways for about 4-5 years. And then when the pandemic hit, I realized there were guys out there who had no place to go. So I started one online, small group, 12, 14 guys. And they would regularly join in. Had a hardcore group, about 6 or 7 of them. And they just loved it. It was just great outlet for them. And I didn't feel like I had to do a lot of therapy,
Okay.
because I'm not a therapist. I am a peer mentor, if you will, rather than
Yes.
a therapist myself. But I could relate stories from others or research I had found to them and let them discuss it and let them arrive at their own conclusions.
Thank you. If a gentleman is interested in starting a grief support group for men, any recommendations or tips you would provide for them?
I would. Right in the back of my book, let me see if I can find it right there. Men's grief group draft meeting template. So I realize that there's a lot of hospices and so on, that churches that don't have a grief group and don't know how to start it. So this is kind of a guide to do that.
That was actually one of my post-it notes there, so I'll just go ahead and take that off. That led right into it. So thank you for that. And when this is aired, there will be a link on our website under recommended resources for someone to be able to use our Amazon associate account and select a link and purchase the book right away, because it is an excellent resource. So now that we're into the book, I have a few post-it notes of some items I want to cover. I am going to start with the introduction. It says, after losing your life partner, there are moments, many of them, in fact, when you may doubt your own very sanity. The greatest fear I had during the earliest stages of my grief was that I was going crazy. losing all control of my thoughts, and that I might make decisions harming myself, my family,
Mhm.
and my friends.
Right.
Thank you for the transparency. You
Mhm.
mentioned about how men don't often share.
Right.
And it's interesting you came in this upbringing that was not very communicative and very emotional. And now that shifted to you being very much that so. And now how that is being used to help other people. Just the
Yeah.
opening of that and the transparency. However, you would like to unpack that a little further, if you would.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I ended up writing that and some of the other very trying and emotional moments, like my wife's passing, after I got pressed really hard by my therapist and my sister, who is a former therapist herself, to dig deeper in the book. And then my editor also said, "You got to go deeper, Fred." So I forced myself to do it. It was painful to do it. And then literally every time I read that and other sections, I just like my tears well up, and I'm right back in that moment. So, but the most common comment I get from my fellow widowers when they first read my blogs or my book is that they are so grateful that they now realize that what they're going through is fairly normal and that
Yes.
they're going to be okay. And that's reason I put that in there so people could see I've been there, I've done that. And yes, you do get to that point, especially during that first 6 months, which I call the deep grieving phase. It's you're isolated, you're lonely as oh God, the loneliness is something you think you've had before, but I'm sorry, no, nothing like this. This loneliness just knocks you off your feet. The grief so painful that it can knock you down on the floor. I'd sometimes feel like I was punched in the gut. I would be like trying to breathe. I couldn't breathe. And I call it the dry heaves of grieving because
Okay.
it's kind of like when you're throwing up and you can't breathe. And then on top of that, you're imagining that your wife is laying next to you in bed and she's not. I'd take walks. I'd reach down to hold her hand, and I sometimes could almost feel it.
Mm,
Uh, so you, this the world becomes sort of surreal, and then to aggravate it even further, in my case, and I've heard many others, same thing. You're lucky if you get 2 hours sleep a night, not for a night, not for 2 nights. I'm talking weeks of getting
yes.
2 to 3 hours sleep. And if you're lucky, you can take a nap during the day. I couldn't. So that lack of sleep makes the surrealness of it all the more aggravated. And your ability to distinguish between what is real and what is not, it just becomes more and more difficult. I would try listening to tapes. I'd listen to meditation tapes. I'd listen to all kinds of things. And the one thing that I found finally that helped me out some is a combination. I learned about melatonin. So I started taking that. That helped a little bit, even though you're not supposed to prescribe it. It's like anything else. You can become addicted to it. So I just warn anybody that's listening to this, be aware and just take it for a little while. Um, but the other thing I found was Eckhart Tolle. Eckhart Tolle is an interesting little guy with a funny laugh who is he teaches me uh, meditation, and he
Okay.
he just teaches about how to calm yourself, and he has just this wonderful quiet beautiful little voice. I mean, he found it all himself the hard way, but he teaches you the sort of the um to stop looking backwards, the Lao Tzu message. If you're looking backwards, you're if you're regretting, you're looking backwards. If you're hopeful, you're looking forward. If you're satisfied, you're in the present. Try to find yourself in the present. Or actually, when you're looking forward, it's anxiety. I'm sorry. Let me say the whole thing again, then you can cut out the bad part. So one thing he talks about is Lao Tzu's message that has become very, very famous, and it's teaches you to, if you're living in regret, you're looking backwards. If you're living in anxiety, you're dwelling in the future. If you're happy and content, you're in the present. So
Mm,
what we need to do is focus on being in the present. So anytime anybody starts getting all anxious and talking to Eckhart Tolle about this and that, he says, you're getting into the future. You don't even know what's going to happen. Why should you worry about that? Why don't you take care of who you are today and get in the right place? And then the rest will unfold more naturally. And I did find, especially when I started dating again, oh my God, the anxiety level would just, woo, it was like dating as a 16-year-old again. You got all the anxiety. Did she like me? Did she not like me? Did I say something stupid? I mean, it's just crazy. So I had to go through that whole process and learn how to modulate myself, and eventually that surrealism and anxiety and regrets is a big one, started to diminish. We just so often allow ourselves to sink into this, and I don't know a widower hasn't done this to some extent, and that is the regret side of things. I
Mm.
should have treated her better. I should have been there with her more. I should have known the illness was prevalent earlier, that kind of thing. It's just all these things that, I'm sorry, you just can't do anything about them right now. You can't.
It can
You,
we are going to leave this world. It is inevitable, and
yep.
those circumstances are out of our control. I want to circle back to something you said.
Okay.
What is the difference between looking at pictures and memories of the life you had with your spouse versus this concept of looking in the past and
Hmm.
causing yourself difficulty in that regards?
I find that when you get into that cycle, you can't get anything done. Your opinion of yourself is down here,
Okay.
and you're just obsessed with trying to fix something you can't fix. So it makes it very difficult for you to process your grief. And I mean, remember, I talk about you have to face it and you have to process your grief. You don't process it by dwelling on the regrets. So it's kind of like a way of avoiding processing your grief. The same way the anxiety thing is. What do I do now? I've got the house. What do I do with this house? What do I do with the car? What am I supposed to do for my kids? All these kinds of questions, and they just will eat you alive if you're not careful.
Thank you for explaining that because I didn't want someone to think that you're saying you should no longer look at pictures. You should know you're
Oh no.
referring to not trying to fix or change what happened in the past, coming to some sense of an acceptance of that. And
I'll even
then,
take it another step,
okay,
which is when you're looking at your pictures, what you want to get to the point of, and I think most of us get there eventually, is to look at them and go, oh my God, I was so lucky to have her in my life. And that was a wonderful experience. I am going to celebrate that. And I love her for it, what she gave me in those moments and everything. So you learn to celebrate it. And that's what you want to do with your spouse who passed away, is to celebrate them and love them and honor them and remember them, all those things.
excellent. Thank you. I have the next section of the book. And so I'm going to let you guys know I'm
Okay.
not going over everything. I'm going
Okay.
over just some tidbits because you want to purchase this book. This is a resource. And if you're listening to this conversation and you are not a widow or widower, but you have a friend that's a widower and you are trying to understand how to show up in this space with them, this is an excellent resource to be able to have that. This section says the frustration I experienced while trying to find materials that would be helpful to me often left me floundering. You kind of covered this already, but I had this highlighted, so I'll speak about it.
Okay.
Visits to online brick and mortar bookstores, online searches from relevant articles to few resources. I did find failed to provide answers. My therapist, who consulted with others as well, also could not find much that was helpful.
Right.
What do you feel is out there now as far, I mean, obviously your book, but do you feel
Right.
like there's a better representation of the voice for men in going through this widower
there is
journey?
there is more appearing, and one of the ones that came out right around the same time my book did was Herb Knowles, the Widower's Journey.
Okay.
And I read all the other books out there that say they cover the same area and try and understand them so I can recommend them if they're good, because I want ones that complement me to be available and to be able to recommend them. So Herb's is one of the better ones out there. So the classic, A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis, going
Mm.
back a couple centuries, was one of the first out there by a man about his
Wow,
widower
I did not know
experience.
C.S. Lewis wrote a book on it, but it makes sense when you think about his life. Okay, that
Yeah,
would have been okay.
yeah, yeah. And then this one was the best one I found at the time. It's Widower When Men Are Left Alone. It was written, it covers 20 case studies, basically, of various widows and what their experience was. So again, you could see the wide range of experiences they have. Unfortunately, it's not in print anymore. So
Okay.
it's sad that it's not. The Widower's Toolbox is another one that's again going out of print as I understand it, but it's just a lot of practical things you need to do as a
Okay.
widower. And then there's Frederick Bachman's And Every Morning the Way Home Gets Longer and Longer. It's a nice little short one.
Okay.
And that name may ring a bell because Frederick Bachman wrote A Man Called Ove,
Oh,
which
okay.
had a Swedish version, and then Tom Hanks made the US version, English speaking version.
Okay.
And then the other one I recommend media wise is Ricky Gervais's Afterlife, which is
Mm.
on Netflix, I think.
Oh, okay.
The best rendition of the widower experience I've seen.
Okay. Nice. Thank you for those recommendations. The next section that I'm in is called Upon Reflection. 1 year after your wife has passed, your grieving process is likely to have gone through many permissions. Well, I'm not pronouncing. I should have had my reading glasses on. That is, I am in denial over here. And okay, that is the problem. Sorry. My experience certainly offers proof of that. After publishing the first revised edition of Widowers to Widower, I realized that there was, wow, Tina, I should have had my glasses.
Want me to read
Oh,
it? What
I
page you
guess
at?
so. Oh my gosh. Okay, scratch all that out, Potatage team. On page 6, upon reflection. Um, no, I think I can do better.
Okay.
Okay, we're gonna try this again. Okay.
Okay.
The
Okay.
next section I want to cover is upon reflection. My experience certainly offers proof that after publishing the first revised edition of Widower to Widower, I realized that there was more to cover. I think when people go through the first year, there's this imagination that check, we've got this grief thing covered, and now we're
Mm-hmm.
just gonna go on with life.
Right.
But upon reflection, what did you find to be different?
um, I certainly found that for up to 2 years after she passed, I'd have moments. The first 6 months were by far the worst. There were more moments in the 6 month, the 1 year period, I'd say. But once I got past the 1 year, it seemed like I was able to settle into more of a normal life. But it was always there. It's always hovering over you. You're very aware of it.
Yes.
And you have reactions when you see something, hear a song, for example, is a classic one that sets me off still. Or you just talk to an old friend who didn't know she passed away, that kind of thing.
How does that constantly happen? It's like, how many people are out there that you still have? I'm sorry, I digress, but it just amazes me. It's like, hi, how's Mark doing? He's dead.
Yeah. I
I'm not
still have it happen once in a while, not often, but somebody
Yes,
finds me on Facebook. Hey, how's Teresa doing? Well, she's gone since 2015. So
awkward.
yes, very
Now you're
much so.
consoling them, but yes,
Right,
in the mail, but
right,
go ahead. Oh my
right.
gosh.
So, but yeah, you do find that over time, well, I think it's different in part depending on whether you do one of the very necessary things, which is let's talk about purpose and reinventing yourself.
Ooh,
Yes.
okay.
If you want to heal and become a contributing member of your family and society again, you need to rediscover who you are because you're not the same person. Your wife's not there to support you and tell you what to do. She has instilled into you a lot of good qualities, hopefully some smarts, and some understanding of the world around you. But she's not there to do it for you anymore. So you have to learn to do it yourself. So discovering who you are is a process we all have to go through. For me, part of it came through joining a group called the Breakfast Club, which is a group of 55 and older singles. Again, about 8 women to every guy. but that's okay. Interestingly enough, not only did I meet some interesting women and eventually my new gal friend, um, I also met some guys. And as a group, we started going hiking, snowshoeing, cross country skiing, all these things I hadn't really done other than hiking and bike riding. We go on long bike rides and stuff and just talk and have a good time, And some were widowers, some were divorcees. And it was, I just got self confident. I felt better about who I was. I felt like, okay, I can do some of this stuff. I was thinking I was 65, older and dead.
Hmm.
So I was going to join my wife within another year or two. So I
Which is
started
very
looking.
often things that people do have to be concerned about if they don't find purpose.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly. And then I joined the Pathways Hospice Board, served on that for 3 years, joined the library board. I'm just finishing up my second 4-year term there. And so that became my purpose, my way of giving back to the community, as well as through the book, of course, and my blogs and things of that nature.
An identity. That
Right.
part I was not prepared that in his absence, it shook me to my core as far as
Right.
who was I now, because
Right.
so much of myself was connected in this relationship, as it should be. That is
Right.
why we're married to someone. And we spend a lot of time thinking about what a marriage would look like. There's not much conversation in preparing for what I would say is the goal of a long marriage to end in one person leaving this world. The goal is
Right.
not divorce, it happens, but we're not really prepared to be
No.
on that part of the relationship.
No, and let's face it, the guys never expect to be the second one to go. They always think they're going to be the first because that's pretty much the norm, right?
Yes.
So yeah, there are what 4 million, almost 4 million widowers in the United States at any given
Mm,
time, 400,000 new ones every year.
yes.
And yet the services and materials and other things out there available to them is pretty limited. And I'll be the first to tell you, out of that 400,000, maybe half of them didn't have that great a marriage and they're okay. But that
This is
still
true.
leaves 200,000 that did have a good marriage and desperately need help. And they are so often they're finding that they don't know how to deal with the family issues and things kind of blow up in their face. They say the wrong things. They're angry. They're striking out at people because they don't know how else to deal with it, and they don't have a therapist in the area they're willing to try, much less actually look for one.
To be
And
vulnerable
so
and say they need help.
right, right, so that's where, if you're a friend of somebody that you see they're suffering and they're not willing to talk to you, give them my book or something like that and encourage them to do it. And I've had guys that said, I was 3 years later, Fred, I wish I'd found your book in the first year because it's helped me a lot. But oh my God, I blew away 2 or 3 years. I could have had a better start of my life again.
Wow. And something you mentioned, I think it even makes it more complicated for the people that did not have such a great marriage, but there is still grief in that process. And
Yes.
they wrestle with the idea, well, we were on the verge of a divorce or these things were happening, and then still giving themselves permission to go, the grief still exists in that process. Because if nothing else, you
Yes.
may be grieving the relationship that you never were able to have in so
Yes.
many other pieces of that.
Not to mention all the guilt
Yes,
from making the relationship not be so good as it should have been. Right. So, but I did
exactly.
have one widow I met who we went out and I asked her, I said, well, how are you doing? And she says, oh, I'm doing great. He was an awful husband. I'm kind of relieved.
That
So
exists.
that
And
does happen. That does happen.
oh my gosh, I talked to so many people, and going back to something we started with, society does not always give kindness to that reality, that they expect people to smile and have this pretense that everything was fine. And the reality is, it's not always the case. And then
Right.
they have to hide how they really feel. So not only are they grieving,
Right.
but putting on this facade on top of it is just
Right.
even more complicated. I'm going to try to do a better job of reading here.
Okay.
The role of hospice. Hospice can come in two forms: hospice facility providing care for terminally ill patients, or in home support to create a caring environment for a loved one who is dying. the focus here is on in-house care.
Right.
How did that just impact your ability to be with your wife and the transition for her?
Well, I'll tell you, the first thing was when we were in the hospital, and my daughters and I had found this hospice availability, that I mentioned it to my wife, and her eyes just teared up, and she was just like, she couldn't talk very well at the time, but I could tell that's what she wanted. She wanted to die at home with her family around her, not in a hospital. And the hospital knows that too. They try and facilitate this wherever possible. So it was awkward at first, figuring out all the things you have to do. They send somebody out to instruct you in how to do it. They send out a caseworker in case you got some mental health issues, other things you got to deal with, and so on. They send out somebody to instruct you on the medication that you have to provide, and then they check in with you. In our case, it was almost every day because it was only a week before she passed. But yeah, they'll stop by and check up on her and kind of give you a report and say, well, I think she's got a few more days, or she's only got another day or two, that kind of thing. They were right and wrong, depending.
Right.
But yeah, I found it to be extremely helpful and much preferable to dying in a facility if possible. There's times when you need a facility, and we just built a new one over at Pathways that's one people actually come and stay at. And that's really meant for people that are being required to require additional support, be it breathing apparatuses or medication adjustments and injections and things of that nature, where it goes beyond the capacity of a elderly spouse to do, that kind of thing.
Thank you. If someone is considering hospice,
Right.
but they say, I don't have any medical experience, I feel like this is going to be beyond me. I'm not sure if I'm able to do this. What would you say to them?
Well, I am about as far over to the extreme of not having experience with medical as anybody you can find. I was raised a Christian Scientist, which means I didn't go to the doctor hard much at all, and
Okay.
I'm still like this when I have to go to the doctor unless I absolutely have to. I don't.
As are most men, but
Yeah,
we'll keep
yeah,
going
it's
and
just
not
our
mention
makeup.
that.
So, but yeah, it's something you just have to learn to deal with, recognize that that's a weakness in us.
It is. But I think what you're saying is it's not beyond somebody. They give you the
Yeah.
skills and ability to be able to be there for your loved.
Yeah, they make it pretty easy. I mean, you do have to deal with things like helping her to get up and make it to the toilet and
Mm-hmm.
things of that nature, but it's amazing. Your mentality shifts and all those fears and stuff just go away
Wow.
because you are so focused on making their last days the best they can be and the least painful that they can be, that you don't really think about that. You can
Beautiful.
do it.
Beautiful. Wow. And that is going to be important because some people can be intimidated by that process.
Very much so. Yeah.
Thank you for having that. The next section, time, length, and other grieving issues addressed. Can I live again? And I want to just cover these four prompts and then I'll let you speak to this however you
Okay.
feel best. Were others dependent upon my ability to remain functional, such as children? Did I have friends and family to support through all of this? Was there a business or community activity that I valued? Did your wife make it clear to you that you had to be strong and continue for the family's sake?
Right. Yeah, my wife was so family focused that I knew that was an important element that I was going to have to get better at. I was one
Mm,
of those classic guys. I'd work two jobs and be busy all the time. Come home, I'd be sitting in front of the TV reading through a notebook that was this thick to get ready for the board meeting the next day, kind of thing. So I was not as involved as I could have been for sure. But I knew my wife was doing a fabulous job. So even though my kids were older, I knew the grandkids and my daughters would be hurting, maybe not as poignantly as I was, but I knew they'd be hurting, and they were. And one in particular really had a tough time with it. She was mama's girl, you know.
Mm,
And so I knew I had to be there for them and support them and let them know that they could come to me, reach out to them. And I did right away. For example, I invited the two daughters over to help me figure out what we're going to do with all mama's stuff, you know.
mm,
So we kind of took it in stages. We did different days for different things, like cleaning out the toiletries. Was there anything there we're salvaging, you know? The clothes. So we broke it into the old clothes that maybe meant something to us, the new ones that she never wore, out, you know, give them
easy.
away, that kind of thing. So we just worked through some of the things together, and I made sure I included them when I started having to think about, you know, the how I was adjusting the will and the trust and all that kind of stuff with my wife gone. And so they'd understand it and not be shocked by any changes that came up. And with the grandkids, we took her robes and they cut them up and made pillowcases from them.
Oh, wow.
So each grandkid had a piece of grandma with them, you know, when they went to bed. That was kind of nice. So, and then the other part was getting active in the community as a means for me to give back, because I knew I had to have a new purpose, and that was how I was going to fulfill it. And it made me feel good to be able to do that, and it helped me to put the regrets and doubts behind me.
Beautiful. Thank you. One statement on the next page stuck out to me. Over time, my will to live gained strength.
Mm, yes, yeah. You would be the odd widower who loved his wife if you didn't at one time consider suicide at some level, you know. I just had a blog out on that a couple of weeks ago that I would recommend to everybody to read. But I think it's good to confront that and acknowledge that, yes, I had those kinds of thoughts. Did I go deep into them? No, I didn't start contemplating how I was going to commit suicide or anything. I just was that sense of, I don't know if I want to live without her, you know?
That sense, yes.
Yeah, yeah. And I'd be perfectly happy to pass right now. And in fact, I had my opportunity about 6 months after she passed. I was out having a beer with a friend, and all of a sudden I doubled over and I said, "Oh God, you got to take me to the hospital right now." I'd been having a hernia problem for a while, and it suddenly just took
Ooh,
off on me. He rushed me to the hospital. They kept asking me. I had told them, I said, "I want do not resuscitate." They said, "What?" No, no, do not resuscitate. If I'm going, I'm going. It's my time. I'm going to go join my wife. And they were like, you know, they had to ask me 3 times, and finally they accepted. That's what I had told them, you know. And I woke up a few hours later in the recovery room, and I looked around and said, "Oh, damn. I
still
guess I'm
here.
supposed to live. I guess I better get to it."
There is something about that. And I'm glad you mentioned that. I don't think oftentimes it's suicidal planned out thoughts. It's
Right.
the concept of I'm okay if I'm not here. If this would be my last day breathing, if I were to leave this world, I would be okay and prefer to be where my spouse is. This
Yep.
not that suicide is not a thing that happens, and there's a suicide hotline number at the end of this podcast and on all
Good.
our blogs, to be able to look at that. And I just want people to understand the idea of thinking I want to be with my spouse is a thought that comes, not so much as the difference between planning and going out. And if
Right.
you're doing that, seek help immediately.
Please.
Make
Yes.
sure
Yes.
you reach out to someone, call suicide hotline, call your therapist, call 911, but don't let those thoughts hover in your mind and not be addressed because they can build
Yep.
into something seriously.
That's where the isolation and loneliness is the
Yes.
deadliest enemy, because it clearly leads to those kinds of thoughts more often than if you're active, seeing your kids and then going out with your grandkids and stuff like that. You're just not going to be thinking that way. I will tell you one thing, though, that when you have that personal experience of holding the hand of your loved one as they pass away, my fear of death just went, I'm not afraid of it anymore. You know, it just, it's a weird thing. And I've heard a lot of other widowers tell me the same thing. Did you have that experience?
That is very much my thought. After Mark died, the reality, yes, exactly the same. My
Okay.
husband's experience, we were in close proximity. He had a major heart attack, and
Okay.
we were there together, and it totally changed my perspective of any fears and anxiety I had about death. That it's part of living, and
Yep.
I won't have to freak out or worry about this. It is part of life, and just
Right.
to, like you said, have purpose and do as much as I can while I'm here and living, and make an impact and help other people.
There's a lot more people like you and me and Herb and another gentleman, Fred Spiro, with the National Widowers Organization, and another friend of mine who runs a suicide uh, education group, and another friend who does Wings for Widows, the financial advice for new widows and widowers. There's so many more of us emerging over the last 3-4 years, reaching out and helping, that I feel like if a widower really wants help, he has a much better chance of finding it now. Back when I lost my wife, you could hardly find anything. It was frustrating as heck, but it's much, much better now.
And that is a good thing. I
Yeah.
am on my last tab here
Okay.
in this section, learning to live alone, truth or bullshit. I'm just gonna let
Ah.
you go from there.
I had some interesting situations arise when I got to the phase where I was saying, okay, I got to make a decision. What am I doing here? And I, so often, my sister, the former therapist, and other women who I dated or met would tell me, Fred, you just got to learn to live by yourself. And I go, what? What are you talking about? I'm sorry. I lived with my wife 45 years. It was a great life. Why would I not want to live with somebody again? And it wasn't until later I realized there was some truth to that,
Mm,
that if we become too dependent upon new people into our lives, we often make bad choices. And when you learn to live by yourself, and by that I mean you live in a residence by yourself, you can still go out and do things with other people, you can still date and other things, but it means not feeling the need to have somebody in your life all the time, whether it be seeing them every day, marrying them, or whatever it may be. But it's learning to be comfortable with yourself, by yourself. And what that allows you to do, once you get to that point, you have a lot more self-confidence and comfort in moving into a relationship with somebody down the road.
I would definitely agree with that.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I see so many people trying to fix their grief problem with joining a
Oh,
relationship,
oh yeah.
and nothing can fix that, because the only thing that would fix it would be our spouses returning. That
Right.
having that peace with yourself and knowing yourself and being comfortable allows you in a good space to be able to have a relationship. Because if you still, and not that, and I don't want to, you will always grieve your spouse some form or fashion. Not saying that that needs to no longer be an issue, but if
Right.
you are trying to just plug and play and cleave and have to have somebody else, I've not seen that work very successfully for anyone.
Yeah. Yeah, the phrase that they often use with therapists is, you can't just put another doll up on top of the wedding cake. Doesn't work that way.
Oh, that has so many visual, like you just stuffed the other one inside. Okay, yeah, that does not work. Wow. Fred, I picked out what I liked about the book and things I wanted to cover. Any particular areas of the book that you would like to highlight?
I think one of the things I talk about a little bit would be therapy in
Okay.
particular, and that it's not something to be afraid of. It's something that can really help you work through things. And I'll give you a little funny example that happened to me the other day. My sister, the therapist, has been going through some medical issues. And we got talking the other day, and I was just calling out to support her, find out what was going on and all this stuff. So we talked for about an hour through all the stuff she's going through, me providing her a little feedback type of thing. And we got to the end of the conversation, and my sister, the therapist, said, you know what? This talking to somebody else really helps. So often we resist it. We resist it and think we don't need to do that, but it does help. Now,
Yes.
I always use the example of in my men's grief groups, and I also specify grief groups grief therapists, not general therapists, not general groups. Has to be grief focused because it is a unique niche that needs people who understand it and can support people through it. But when you go, oh God, I lost my thought.
You're
Yes,
talking
okay.
about, okay, go ahead.
So in the men's grief group, often when they would come in, I could always tell the new guys like that. They'd sit there with their arms crossed like this and kind of like, oh, you're not going to tell me anything new. I can't be helped. I'm a mess, you know. And about 40 minutes into the meeting, they'd be leaning forward and they'd be focusing and they'd be talking. So they realized very quickly that there was added value by coming to the grief groups and not only hearing what others had to say, but sharing their own story. And that brings me to a final point that I'll mention, which is tell your story as often as you can to as many people as you can, because every time you tell your story, the story of you, your wife, her passing, you heal just a little bit and you just feel a little bit better. So you have to keep at it. It's like you'll tell your story 10, 20 times a day. It's okay. It helps.
It does. It does. Thank you for just sharing your book, sharing your journey. I ask you a lot of questions. Any questions of me?
I'm interested where you are in your process now. How many years has it been since your husband passed?
We are recording, it is 7 years this month. We are
Oh,
recording
very
in
close to
March.
mine. Yes, yes.
Yes, he passed in 2017. So
Okay.
yeah, 7 years.
Yeah, it's quite a journey, isn't it? You kind of go, where's it going to go from here? I stopped worrying about it a few years ago.
Yes, I remember that first year, every day waking up going, "Huh, I'm awake again. Huh, I
Yeah,
woke up again." And the hardest part was trying to start planning a future and
yeah,
coming to terms that the future could exist outside of Mark's presence and coming to
yeah.
peace with that. And
Yes,
starting to, like you talked about the financial plans, those things that needed to be done, administrative items. And I was stuck for a good year, unable to make a lot of those decisions because I
right,
wanted to have a
right,
clear mind. I
right,
wanted to make some logical choices, not emotionally based. So I
right.
gave myself space. There wasn't anything that had to happen immediately. And that giving myself space and then being able to make better decisions, I felt good about that choice.
Yeah, that helped me a lot too. And I emphasize it with every widower I speak with. Wait a year. There's a reason they have that rule out there. It just you're just not ready to make big decisions in that first year. Yeah. God, if I had married a couple of the gals I dated in that first year where the relationship just wasn't going to go anywhere that was right, it would have been a horrible decision if I'd sold my house too soon, if I'd done, various major decision type things. You can't undo those. So it's better just to be patient and wait, get your grief worked through first, and then deal with it.
And that is true. And scientifically speaking, I mean, the prefrontal cortex is experiencing things such as
Yeah,
trauma, and then the
right.
amygdala is experiencing that flight and flight. I cannot even say it now. That flight and fight mode.
But there
So
you go. Yeah,
what
yeah.
was a part of our brain in the prefrontal cortex is making decisions that's allowing us to have memory. We become very primitive. And so that
Hmm.
is not the space and our normal cognitive skills that we want to make life altering
Right,
decisions that but people, well, I'm different. Yes, everyone will manage and house their grief different, but scientifically we're kind of made up some of the same basic components, and our body responds to different things such as the
right,
death of a close of a loved one and the trauma and what that looks like. And that 1 year, the swelling and different things that go on in our brain, that's important to give our body. But what we don't see, we often don't value. So if it's going on in our mind, we're not
hmm,
seeing that and realizing that is impacting our ability. I mean, we
right,
could be emotionally distracted, mistakenly continually driving off of the wrong exit, not being able to remember a list of things that you need to do. If you're seeing those different signs of for yourself, give yourself some grace to just go through the process and hold off
right.
what you don't have to do immediately.
When you look back and you remember going through that, you say, now, was that a good time to start dating? Was that a good time to start entering a romantic relationship with somebody after you haven't dated for 40 plus years?
Not at
The
all.
answer is no.
Not at all. Any other questions of me?
No, no, that's
Okay.
good. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
I will allow you to wrap up this conversation to the widowhood. Maybe there was a topic you wanted to cover that we didn't, but I'll allow you to wrap up this
Okay.
conversation.
Well, I think I kind of said it before. I would like the close to be about, reaching out and telling your story. I think that's such a basic issue. I think that's a good one to close on. I don't think I can add anything to that.
Okay. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us.
You bet. And thank you for doing what you're doing. I'm sure you're reaching some people across the country, and I'm excited to be a part of
Thank you.
it.
Thank you for spending another episode with Widowhood Real Talk. If you found the contents of today helpful, share the episode to anyone you know who may need it. Subscribe to the show and tune into Widowhood Real Talk each week. Then visit widowhood-realtalkwithtina.org to join the community and access additional resources. Remember, you are not alone in this journey.